key to our progress along the Eightfold Path in Buddhism lies with our ability and intention to make effort along the path. Right effort is a key component of the Eightfold Path. And right effort has 4 different aspects to it. I've discussed the first 2 of those aspects in prior videos. I'll leave links to those videos down below in the notes. It doesn't really matter what order we come to these, so you can always watch those after this one. In any event, the third of these aspects of effort is the effort to develop. And this effort to develop is when we notice that there are certain helpful or skillful qualities that we might have but don't, or that we don't have in deep enough form. So we make an effort to develop those qualities that we don't already have. So what does the Buddha say about this intention, this effort? He says this: it's when a mendicant develops the awakening factors of mindfulness, investigation of principles, energy, rapture, tranquility, immersion, and equanimity, which rely on seclusion, fading away, and cessation, and ripen as letting go. This is called the effort to develop. Now, this list of 7 factors that we should develop may be familiar to some of us. It's the 7 factors of enlightenment or 7 factors of awakening. And the Buddha says that these 7 factors depend upon seclusion, fading away, and cessation. So that's a lot to consider developing here. It's a large field of action, a large field of effort. Indeed, we might even say it's the whole of the Buddhist path on a certain interpretation. But let's begin by discussing what those 7 factors of enlightenment depend upon. In particular, we can begin with seclusion. This involves secluding ourselves from those unhelpful or unskillful aspects of the world that get in the way of our progress. Now, these can be external or internal factors. So, for example, if they're external, we may, for example, want to seclude ourselves from people that we find unhelpful to us. If we find that there are certain people in our lives that make us angry or make us irritated or make us greedy in certain ways, that make us act in ways that are not in our own best interests, then it may be useful for us to seclude ourselves from them to an extent. It may be that there are certain actions that we take externally or involving external things that are, again, not helpful to us, that perhaps make us angry or greedy, or that make us lash out to other people, treat other people badly, certain situations that we may get into, certain perhaps things that we may ingest or take that may make us unskillful in certain respects, and then we may want to seclude ourselves from those things. And then, of course, importantly, there may be internal factors that we may want to seclude ourselves from. In particular, if we find ourselves getting angry, getting greedy, we may want to try to find methods of reducing that anger and reducing that greed. And so secluding ourselves in a way of speaking, in a manner of speaking, secluding ourselves from these unskillful mental factors. And as we seclude ourselves from these unskillful mental factors, they begin to fade away and cease. Or at least they do sometimes over the long term. This is a long-term practice, but at least that's the idea. That as we seclude ourselves from situations that perhaps make us act out in certain ways, we'll act out less often. We'll have more of a handle on our own activity, on our own mental states. We're in a better position to begin the task of attaining these factors of enlightenment. Now, what are the factors of enlightenment? Now, to begin with, there are different interpretations of what this list really means. I've gone into some of that in a prior video, which I'll also leave linked down below in the notes if you want to learn more about these factors of enlightenment. They're very important in the path, but I'll just take a relatively everyday interpretation of them for the purposes of this video. So to begin with, the first factor of enlightenment is the factor of mindfulness itself. So we might say that to develop mindfulness, well, we perhaps may sit in formal meditation. We may spend time, we may make time every day to say, spend 15 minutes or half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever time we happen to have available in mindfulness meditation. And then, of course, we can bring that mindfulness from the cushion out into our daily lives more and more. After all, mindfulness is meant to be a state that is not simply the sort of thing that we do while we're in formal meditation, but it's supposed to be the thing we're doing all the time. So perhaps we begin to make room for mindfulness in more of our lives. Then the next factor is investigation of states or principles, however it's understood. The general idea here is that when we're in that mindfulness, when we have that mindfulness, we can use mindfulness to investigate what sorts of mental states arise. One thing we may investigate is what sorts of mental states arise from what sorts of experiences we have in our lives. In particular, perhaps what sorts of skillful mental states arise from what, and what sorts of unskillful states arise from what. And as we begin to understand that difference, then we can begin, or at least continue the work of secluding ourselves from those things that are less helpful and making more room for those things that are more helpful. This is a process of investigation, of learning about what works for us and what doesn't. What works for us may not be the same thing as what works for our neighbor. So we need to understand in our own case what works, and then put that knowledge to use. The third of these factors is energy. We can think of this as perhaps that energy arises from the curiosity that we have engendered here. So we get into a mindful situation, we become curious, we begin to find things out. That finding things out gives us more energy to continue along on the path, to continue in our work of self-development. Then the next factor along the path is known as the factor, sometimes translated as rapture. Rapture is a particular translation of a Pali term, which can be used in a number of different situations. It may seem a little bit odd in an everyday sense that rapture is going to arise, but basically we can understand this, I think, in an everyday sense as that joy arises, that happiness arises, a certain kind of pleasure arises as we begin to understand what's going on in our lives, as we begin to gain energy in this process of development, as we begin to make progress in a certain way. Perhaps our stress levels begin to ease slightly. We begin to take joy in the whole process of the practice. Then the last three factors of enlightenment are tranquility, immersion, and equanimity. I'm not going to go through these one by one, but the basic idea here, at least from an everyday interpretation, is that as we progress along this path, our stress levels become reduced, we become more tranquil, we become more equanimous with the world, we become more equanimous with our lives. Our stress is reduced, our dukkha, or suffering, is reduced. This is a path that eventually, as the Buddha says, ripens in letting go, as we learn to let go of the things that we are craving and clinging to. As we reduce that craving, as we reduce that clinging, again, the stress continues to decrease. This is a long-term process. It's a gradual path in the early Buddhist sense, not something that we would expect to get. It's not as though each of these factors of enlightenment is overcome one by one and we're sort of step by step and within 7 steps we're enlightened. That doesn't work that way. Rather, it's a kind of a cyclical process where we go through stages, we learn them, we come back to, let's say, mindfulness, the first stage, we learn more, we make certain changes or certain alterations as we see the world differently, our stress gets leveled, then we go back to mindfulness. It's a continual process, I think, of generation as we progress down the path, this path of development, developing these states that we didn't have previously, that we notice that we didn't have. We make this continuous effort, this right effort, and this effort eventually begins to bear fruit. Fruit in the progress along the path towards a reduction in stress, reduction in dukkha or suffering. So we'll tackle the fourth of these stages or types of effort in our next video, and when that's ready, I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen. Thanks so much for watching. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below and in the notes. And we hope to catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.